Hello. Hi, Pierre.
Hello, how are you?
And hello. Good. And hello, everyone watching. This is CSAJ's Spotlights on our expert advisors. And today we're thrilled to have Pierre from Casa de Esperanza. And just to before we dive in with Pierre, to give a little context to CSAJ and why we're bringing Pierre in front of you today, CSAJ is a national organization striving to develop and promote transformative advocacy that removes systemic barriers, enhances organizational responses, and improves professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. So this work really centers around the intersection of poverty and domestic violence. And so to do this, we really need multiple and diverse partnerships and their unique and rich expertise and perspectives to enhance economic security for all survivors. So we're thrilled to work with Pierre and a whole host of anti-poverty, race equity, and violence against women activists in CSAJ's Legal Impact for Racial and Economic Equity project, which really aims to shift some of the current violence against women paradigms around centering survivors that have been marginalized for various reasons. So Pierre, we are welcome and honored to have you. And he's going to share a little bit about himself, his work with CASA, partnership with us, as well as kind of bigger picture reflections on the movement, the framework that he and CASA uses, and some visioning. So thanks again, Pierre. So if you don't mind, I just said a lot. Can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us who you are, your organization, all of those things about you.
Sure, if I forget anything, kind of remind me. So my name is Pierre Berastain. I'm the Assistant Director for Innovation and Engagement at Casa de Esperanza, the National Latino Network. And we are the National Institute on Domestic Violence, or really more than domestic violence, stalking, human trafficking, sexual violence in the Latino community in the United States. And we also do work internationally. And I would say that the main kind of approach, or not approach, but pillars of the organization in terms of the work we do can be broken down into four different buckets, if you will. One of them would be public policy, and working a lot with our legislators and government agencies to ensure that policies and different kind of regulations are representative and working for justice for Latino survivors and communities of color. Then we also have a research division that does a lot of research and work at the intersections of violence and identity, as well as kind of systemic forms of oppression, systemic inequity and inequality, and the way that systems end up impacting Latino survivors specifically. And then we also have a training and technical assistance team that provides training, the capacity building, technical assistance to other organizations, to federal agencies, to local, state institutions, to universities. And so that's our training and technical assistance component. And finally, we have really a communications branch that does a lot of work in terms of communicating the importance of this work, and I don't want to say marketing, but to some degree, yes, marketing this as not just a something to be feared in terms of the topics that we covered, but something to take head on, and something to strive for a change. And to that end, we produce a number of materials, we produce campaigns, and so that also falls within the communications and marketing branch.
That's all? That's amazing. One thing that I'm have always been a really big fan of about CASA's work is because you also have a direct services link, and how amazing the amazing work that you do to really link individual and community-based advocacy to all of these buckets. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what goes on in that work?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. And that is kind of our So the 4 buckets that I mentioned, or the 4 pillars, are within the kind of our national work. But our national work really couldn't happen without our being fully informed of what's happening on the ground, right? And that's kind of the second part that you're talking about, really. And we are grounded in the local realities of communities and individuals. And so to that end, for example, we have a shelter and a community program that is more than just a shelter in St. Paul, in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota. And the organization really started as a movement of Latinas getting together and saying, we need something for our community. And it began as a grassroots movement, and as many groups gathered in the 70s and 80s, and then it grew into this national organization. And the relationship between the two varies depending on the projects, right? But ultimately, the work that happens on the ground in the Twin Cities with the community, with the Latino community, the experiences of either marginalization or having survivors who are undocumented, or community members who are fearful of systems for one reason or another. All of that ends up informing the national work, as well as the resilience strategies, the strengths that the community uses to kind of move forward, and in Spanish we say superar, or in other words, lift yourself up, or lift the community up, right? To go past the obstacles, if you will. All of that also informs our national work in terms of the strengths and resilience that communities bring to these issues and to their lives. And so that's that aspect of our local work. And then we have, as part of that local work, a really strong framework of what we call community engagement. And it's not just outreach in terms of what we call the mainstream way of doing business. And that would be to just send a message out to communities and say, hey, here is the information, come to us, right? Or here are the services we offer, join us on such and such date. No, our community engagement model really is a way for community to tell us what they need, for them to drive the process. It's not community as passengers on the back seat, but community as drivers or co-drivers with us, co-pilots with us. And that's really a great model, because it ends up transforming the organization every few years. Because needs shift and communities shift and change, and so our work has to accommodate and in order to respond effectively to those changes that happen inherently in communities. And so by keeping a close ear, eyes on what's happening on the ground, we're able to change the work we do, both locally and nationally, and the way that we advocate for survivors and communities. So I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's amazing. And speaking of, I really appreciate the intentionality behind the framework and the engagement and that you use. And so kind of taking that and segueing to the REEP project, and part of that is bringing that and the different frameworks that all the partners on this project have as well. So, and REEP really is a project that draws from these different areas of advocacy with different frameworks, different movement making structures. So given these perspectives and experience, we have done some time creating and at least talking about what a common language in race equity or systems advocacy and all these different things mean. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective or framework that informs your work in thinking about race and economic equity?
Oh boy, right.
I realize that's a really small, easy to answer question,
yeah,
but however you want to take that.
Right, I was going to say that's a whole PhD, right there. So the way that we see race and economic equity impacting our work, that's really the core of the question. Everything that we do looks at the disproportionate impact on different communities, and when we say communities, we don't also mean race. We don't only mean race, although race is an important component of how communities get formed. By by people themselves or imposed by governments, as it was the case in South Africa, for example, right? And so race plays this role in really in really kind of organizing communities. And I would say that this is getting a little bit kind of theoretical now, but I would say that traditionally, race has been kind of understood as the child of racism. I recently read a book by I forget how to say his first name, but it's Coates, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates, I believe, right?
Oh, Ta-Nehisi Coates, yeah.
Yeah, and it was absolutely a wonderful book, and that's one of the things that he says there, right? Is that race is the child, not the father, of racism, and so I find that concept very very enlightening in the sense that if we look at it from that perspective, we look at race as a byproduct of what we've done in our history, and so thereby we can approach it as really that, a byproduct, and a way that we would approach a rebellious child, if you will, and that you have to approach it with care, with some love, and realizing that it has strengths as well, right? A lot of us do get a lot of strength from our ethnicity, from our culture, from our race. So anyway, so all of that to say that we have a complicated relationship with race. That on one hand, we see the way that systems use race in order and economic inequality to perpetuate harm, but we also see these factors as or communities use these factors also as strengths, as finding community, as finding resilience, and so I'm not entirely sure whether that fully answers the question, but it gives you a little bit of a portal into the way we see different issues or different kind of topics, if you will, and that is that many of these issues, many of these topics have, to some degree, a double-edged sword, or a double-edged blade, if you will. And that's, I would say that most of the work we do falls within that kind of perspective.
Yeah, no, that's great. And bringing it out of the theoretical place to more practical place or concrete. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe particular racial or ethnic or political identities shape the experiences of some of the survivors you work with, and or, as you were mentioning, the barriers they face? Because I think one's race and ethnicity is one conversation, and then the disparities that are an outcome of how society and different structures treat that is another thing. But can you talk a little bit about the unique experiences of the communities that you work with and how those identities kind of play a role?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that I come from Peru, and my family migrated back in 1998. And part of the reason for our immigration was kind of the social political oppression that the country was going under the Fujimori regime. And what I saw there, and I think what remained in my mind as I kind of grew up in the US and did my studies in the US, I always was intrigued by what were the social dynamics that were taking place in Peru and the dynamics of violence that were taking place in Peru. And that's how I got into this work, because the government ended up targeting specifically so many already marginalized communities, especially in the Andes, in the mountainous region of Peru. The government had forced sterilizations, for example, that overwhelmingly impacted what would be considered in Peru communities of color or indigenous communities. And so identity, it was very clear for me from the very beginning that identity played a huge role in the way that people were treated and in the way that systems engaged individuals. And so I say that because we typically think of what I just described as happening outside of the Western world, or outside of the quote unquote advanced or industrialized world. And of course, we know that's not the case, right? We know that for our case, for example, undocumented survivors don't have access to a number of critically critical services, if you will, that would make a big difference in the way that their lives play out, or that they might have access, but that the system doesn't treat them equally. So, for example, you asked me, specifically in child custody cases, it can be it can happen that survivors who are undocumented are more likely, in a particular case, to lose their children because they're undocumented, so that's a systemic kind of treatment towards a survivor, or it could happen that at a more kind of personal level, that perpetrators or people who use violence tell survivors, if you say anything, I will have you be deported, or if you say anything, I will take away the children and you'll never see them again. So those are some of the dynamics that end up happening. In terms of communities of color more broadly, we see the disparate impact of systems on communities of color all the time. There are housing authorities that have told survivors, where is your restraining order? If you don't have a restraining order, there is no way that you have experienced domestic violence in home. So we're not granting you domestic violence status in order for you to apply for public housing because you don't have that restraining order. Well, given that all of what we know around relationships between communities of color and police in the United States, especially something that has emerged in the last 2 or 3 years, we would understand perhaps why survivors might not immediately go towards a restraining order, right? That would be one reason, that the relationship between police and communities. Another reason could be that people have, that immigrants might have a contentious relationship or understanding of police, right? Based of what they brought from their home countries. I know when I came to the United States, I was frightened sometimes of the police because of my experience, of my family's experiences in Peru. And so people's past experiences, people's current experiences and relationships with systems impact the way that they interact. And certainly their identity, their race, their ethnicity end up impacting as well the way they are treated and the way that they experience our society.
Mm-hmm. To pick up on that, I want to go back to some of the work that you're doing, both with CSAJ and REEP, but also in your broader universe. Are there movements or initiatives or policy work that is on the horizon, or what's exciting you about kind of shifting some of that right now, particularly given the current climate, if you will?
Right. So what is exciting about it? I think what's exciting is that there is still, what's exciting and disheartening, I should say, is that there is still so much work to do, right? My mind right now is specifically on college campuses, and I'm just going to give you one example because I'm working on a college campus grant currently, so that's why my mind is on that at the moment. And what's exciting is that we've made so much progress in terms of reporting, in terms of having funding available for universities and directives for universities as to how they're supposed to approach this work. We have had investigations about violations that universities have violated the rights of students around Title IX, et cetera, et cetera. So we've made a lot of progress. The areas that I can see for us going into in terms of violence prevention or sexual assault prevention in the future is, how does this work look in a culturally specific manner? Or how does this work look if we are really taking into consideration diverse populations? Because the the movement around sexual assault and intimate partner violence in colleges have pretty much been mainstream heterosexual, white, and female-led and women-led. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just that we end up missing some other populations or some other experiences. So again, the experience of an undocumented gay survivor who might not be believed by the administration because he is gay, and gay people don't experience violence, right? And that's the message that he gets. Mm-hmm. Or who might be afraid to report to the police because of fear of deportation, or who might not be made aware that under VAWA he or she is eligible for certain legal protections around, because of these crimes. And so we have minimal requirements for universities, but there are all these other kind of considerations or work that needs to be done in terms of being able to work with survivors from minority groups, from marginalized groups, international students, students with disabilities, right? We still have so much progress to do in that regard. So, and so much work to do in that regard. So at CASA, we are very excited that we've received funding from OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women, through the Department of Justice, to work specifically on bringing that cultural piece, that population-specific piece to their campus programs and to their grantees. They fund a number of universities and college campuses, community colleges throughout the United States to do violence prevention and intervention work. And what they found was that the cultural population-specific piece was missing, and that universities were not really reaching these students fully. And so they brought us in for that work, and we're very excited about that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. And I think it has good parallels with the REEP project and the different perspectives that the partners bring. And you've played a critical role in some of the components of it, which are selecting and working with impact sites to figure out what is happening, what strategies are successful, what they feel like they need to really uplift or amplify the work that they're doing, as well as doing broader assessments and looking at through all of these lenses with survivors of color, Indigenous and Native survivors, immigrant, and survivors of, from other marginalized communities. Is there anything, what are you excited about in the road going forward with that, whether it's a partnership piece, the work on the ground, or just reflections on kind of where we've come in the ground laying piece of it thus far?
Sure. So I'm definitely excited about the partnership, because I think that you guys are a wonderful organization with wonderful people working behind it and really running it. So, and I've been so excited, and I know Casa has been very excited about this relationship between us and you. So I'll start off by saying that. But we're also excited about what can come out in a year from now because of this project, right? We know that we wanna see how race equity tools can be used to really advocate for systems change, for example. But we also know that many communities don't know how to use those tools to advocate. So by partnering with some of the sites and giving them some of the tools, they can pick and they can say, this really works for us. And so we're going to use this, and we're going to measure, or we're going to determine how certain systemic ordinances or rules or regulations or policies are disproportionately affecting our community. So I'm excited about that, and I'm excited to have documentation of that. I'm excited to be able to see this is how you can replicate this model. And so I've given the example in other meetings around, there's this organization that found out that the Latino survivors were not showing up to court, and they were kind of delinquent for not showing up to court. And so a very kind of small advocacy piece that they took on was, we're going to contact the court and say, if you send out notifications in Spanish and English, it's much more likely that survivors will show up, because the court was calling or was sending notifications, was calling in English, leaving messages in English, and day and night when they started implementing, when the court started implementing that policy of sending notifications bilingually. And you know, it's kind of if you will, the unintended consequences of mainstream actions. And there's nothing evil behind sending a notification in English, right? That's just the way it works. But ultimately, the system focuses on really the outcome that we want. We are here as a court. We are here to serve people, to provide justice. And so the outcome that we want is for people to show up. And so what do we do in order to have that happen? Well, we're going to change the notification process. Something that simple, right? That once I say it, or once other people say it, it's like, oh yeah, of course you would do that. But the reality is that when you're an executive director, when you are an advocate whose entire day is devoted to the service provision of a victim or of a survivor, and you're overwhelmed with grants, you're overwhelmed with reporting, with all of this, you don't really have the time, to be honest, to sit back and think, how do I engage the system creatively? Because your creativity really gets swamped or drained, if you will, by all the stresses that you end up having. So what's really exciting about REEP is that we get to then document all of the different creative tools, creative methods that people are using to engage systems and do really transformative, to take transformative steps, and then be able to then show communities and just say, here is how you do it. Here is what you can do, and then see what happens. So I'm really excited about that.
Or engage with it, right? I love that you said that, creative systems advocacy, and I think that's a great way to conceptualize REEP, is really helping or carving out some space for communities that are doing a lot to be able to sit and really think about their creative systems advocacy, so that I like to say, so we can throw all the things in the middle of the room, play around with them, and figure out what they're already doing, and lift that up and share it, and also see if there are things that have been left untouched that would be a good, lever of change to pull, so to speak. So I'm really grateful to have you and Casa in partnership on this and thinking with us through it, because there's a lot that communities are doing that has gone unheard, and there's a lot that all the partners in this work can do to uplift and hopefully advance that work as well, so that we can continue in this together. So I feel like I could talk with you all day, Pierre, but I want to bring it back out for kind of a bigger, maybe just visioning question. I know from some of my reading of your own work that you have a background in divinity and you're a big thought leader. I don't know how you approach that that concept, but I just am curious on your take on some of the I don't know if they're concepts or movements or words, or if it's another language thing. There are a lot of words and concepts being thrown around: economic justice, economic empowerment, things like that. What are your just thoughts on the movement, on what those things mean to you based on the work and the communities you're with, and how do you see, what do you envision for, either this year or the work going forward?
Right, that's perhaps way to end the conversation, right? the big question around
small questions over here.
Yeah.
Small
I don't know
questions.
if I would consider myself a thought leader by any means, but I'm going to pick on a part of the question that you asked. I think there is a kernel in there that I like, a thread that I like to kind of carry, and that is, how do we, what do we do in the next year or the next 3 years or whatever, as we're doing this work? And I think that it's become increasingly evident and important for us to, as the movement says, engage, meet people where they are. Now, typically, we have used that phrase, meet people where they are, when speaking about survivors, right? Survivor doesn't want to go to the shelter. You need to meet the person where the person is, right? Maybe there is a reason the person doesn't want to go to the shelter. Maybe the person doesn't want to leave the relationship. How do we work with that, right? What resources do we have? Or the person is, because of religion, the person doesn't want X, Y, or Z, or the person does want this, but this is not part of the mainstream response. So how do we accommodate that, right? So we've used that phrase, meet people where they are, really from that perspective, but we haven't really used it for the opposition, if you will, for people who resisted this work, right? For people who call us feminazis, or for people who say, I don't see color, or people who push against the work that we're doing. And I think this becomes a challenge for the field. I think that I'm not the only one to say that the field has been speaking among itself, and we all know that, right? And the field needs to speak among itself, because the field is not together, right? The field is not at the same page. So there is so much value for the field to continue conversations among each other, for you and I, and for CASA and CSAJ and all other organizations to have conversations constantly. Yes, we need to keep that space. And we also need to then expand our audience by not thinking that our approach or our answer is the only one. And that is so difficult, because when I hear racist comments, or I hear chauvinistic language, sexist commentary, my first reaction is to say, what the heck, right? No, you're wrong. Like, and this is why. And let me tell you about feminist theory, and let me tell you about, whatever. And that's not where the person is at, right? Where the person is at that racist comment. And so as a field, we need to get better tools around how do we properly meet these folks where they are, so that we engage with them in a meaningful way. How do we engage with them so that minds begin to shift? So for example, we talked about race earlier, and race is an incredibly loaded word in the United States, right? It's kind of like a loaded gun, if you will. And you drop the word race, and the entire mood of the room changes, and the entire conversation changes. And there is a reason for that. This country has a history of using race to suppress people, to enslave them, to commit horrific acts, right? So there, and so there is this guilt among those who have inherited this system of oppression, and then there is this resentment from folks who have been, who are descendants of the oppressed, if you will. So of course it's a loaded question, and it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. It just means that some people might not be there yet. And so as a field, we need to be comfortable with saying the person's not ready to talk about race, and that's okay. But the person might be ready to talk about culture, and his or her own culture, and how his or her own experiences have impacted the way that this person interacts in the world. And we all have those stories. Everybody likes to talk about their heritage, about where they come from, about their own experiences. People love to talk about themselves. And so if we approach it, it's kind of like you approach in this particular example, if you approach race through the back door, you get there. You will get to the living room still, just not through the front door. And people come to it with more amenable terms, if you will. So as a field, we just need to find language. We need to find frameworks to meet people who disagree with us where they are at. And I think that's one of the things that I see for us to work on in the next year, 2, 3, 4, and so on, as we do this work, especially in the current environment.
Mm-hmm. And knowing when to make noise as well. It's a strategic decision, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow, Pierre, this is great. I love working with you, love talking with you. I really appreciate all your thoughts. on your work, on partnership, on race equity, on systems advocacy. There are a lot of things that, like I said, need to be thrown into the pile so we can make something beautiful for each other and our communities. And just thank you for being part of the work. And just for folks listening, Pierre mentioned some of the race equity tools or approaches that we'll be playing around with. So I do want to direct everyone to CSAJ's website, because we'll be having some webinars and other things that really lay out what exactly those are in the future, so that myself and Pierre, you don't have a legal background, do you?
I do not. Surprisingly, everybody
Yeah.
thinks that I'm a lawyer for some reason, but I have no legal background at all.
Such is the field we're in, right? So yeah, so that Pierre and I don't have to explain what some of these approaches are. Look for those things, and we'll have more to come. And CASA has amazing resources as well, and so just keep an eye out on CSAJ's website, on CASA's website, about some of the exciting work going forward. And so just thanks again, Pierre, for being here, for talking with us, and for bringing your whole self to the work, and being with us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Goodbye.